Let us go to the first puzzle. The threats are: rook takes pawn, queen takes queen, queen takes knight, queen takes pawn. The checks are: queen to b6, check, queen to c5, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Queen to b6, check, rook to f2, knight to e3, queen to e2, knight takes rook. Another one. Threats in this position are: rook takes rook, check, queen takes pawn. Here are the checks. Rook takes rook, check, queen to g2, check, queen to h1, check, queen to c5, check, queen to b6, check, knight to f3, check. Answer to this puzzle is: knight to f3, check, rook takes knight, queen takes rook, queen takes queen, rook takes queen. Next, threats in puzzle position are: bishop takes knight, queen takes bishop, check, rook takes knight. Here are the checks. Queen takes bishop, check, queen to h5, check. The best move in puzzle position is: rook takes knight, pawn takes rook, bishop to b5, king to c8, bishop takes queen, check. Let us go to the next puzzle. The threats are: bishop takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Bishop to c6, check, bishop to d3, check. The puzzle is solved using: bishop to c6, check, king to e5, b5. One more. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Bishop takes knight, queen takes knight, knight takes pawn, knight takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The answer is: queen takes knight, queen to g6, f5, queen takes queen, bishop takes queen. Let us go to the next puzzle. Here are the threats. Queen takes knight, queen takes pawn, check, bishop takes bishop, rook takes pawn, bishop takes pawn. Here are the checks. Queen takes pawn, check. The best move in puzzle position is: bishop takes bishop, queen to c5, check, rook to f2, rook takes bishop, rook takes rook. Another puzzle. The threats are: there are no threats in this position. The checks are: queen to b5, check. The answer is: queen to b5, check, rook to c6, queen takes bishop, rook takes pawn, check, king to d1. One more. The threats are: queen takes pawn, queen takes pawn, queen takes pawn, check. Here are the checks. Queen takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using: bishop to g5, queen to g6, queen takes queen, pawn takes queen, bishop takes rook. Another one. Here are threats in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, bishop takes knight. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Bishop takes knight, queen takes bishop, bishop to f3, rook to b8, queen takes pawn. Let's continue. Here are the threats. Pawn takes bishop. There are no checks in this position. Answer to this puzzle is: pawn takes bishop, rook takes rook, bishop takes rook. Next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Rook takes knight, bishop takes pawn, check, knight takes pawn, knight takes pawn. Checks in this position are: bishop takes pawn, check. Answer to this puzzle is: knight takes pawn, rook to d2, knight takes rook. Let's continue. Here are threats in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn. Checks in this position are: rook to b6, check, rook to a5, check, bishop to c8, check. The answer is: bishop to g2, queen to e7, king to b3, g4, rook to b4. Next puzzle. The threats are: rook takes rook. There are no checks in this position. The puzzle is solved using: rook takes rook, king takes rook, king to g5, king to f8, king to f6. Next, the threats are: knight takes pawn, knight takes pawn, pawn takes knight, rook takes pawn, check. Here are checks in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn, check, rook to g3, check. The best move in puzzle position is: rook takes pawn, check, king to h8, Pawn takes knight. Rook takes rook. Rook takes rook. Let's see the next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes rook, check. Here are the checks. Rook takes pawn, check. Queen to f7, check. Queen takes rook, check. The puzzle is solved using queen takes rook, check. Knight takes queen. Rook to a8. Queen to f7. b6. Let us go to the next puzzle. Here are the threats. Rook takes queen. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are queen takes pawn, check. The answer is rook takes queen. Rook takes pawn. King to h8. Bishop to e5. Queen to g6. Next, here are threats in puzzle position. There are no threats in this position. The checks are queen to g8, check. Queen to h8, check. Queen to h3, check. The answer is queen to h3, check. Rook to h6. b7. Rook to h5. Queen takes rook. Next puzzle, here are the threats. Pawn takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Answer to this puzzle is pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. King to d5. g5. c5. c4, check. King to e5. Another puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Queen takes rook, check. Queen takes queen, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Rook takes pawn, check. Bishop takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen takes rook, check. Queen takes queen, check. Queen to h6, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn, check. The answer is rook takes pawn, check. Queen takes rook. Queen takes queen, check. King to g8. Bishop takes pawn. One more. Here are the threats. Bishop takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Here are checks in puzzle position. Bishop to d4, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to f2, check. Queen to d4, check. Solution to the puzzle is bishop to d4, check. King to h1. Bishop to e5. Rook to f4. Bishop takes rook. Bishop takes bishop. Queen takes bishop. Next, the threats are there are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Bishop to f4. Rook takes knight. Pawn takes rook. Let us go to the next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Bishop takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is knight to g3. Queen takes queen. Knight takes rook, check. King to g1. Pawn takes queen. Another one. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are queen takes rook. Rook takes queen. Checks in this position are queen to g7, check. Queen to h8, check. The puzzle is solved using queen to f6. Rook to c1, check. Rook takes rook. Queen to d2. Queen to c3. Let's see the next puzzle. The threats are bishop takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes knight, check. Checks in puzzle position are knight to d3, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes knight, check. The answer is knight takes pawn. Pawn takes knight. Rook takes pawn. Queen takes rook. Knight to d3, check. Let's continue. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are bishop takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook takes rook. Checks in this position are queen takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is bishop to e3. Rook takes rook. Rook takes rook. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes knight. Queen takes queen. Bishop takes queen. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.